Hello, YouTube. Welcome to this week's Flyday episode 6. Essential air services between Kilo Sierra Tango Lima and Kilo Tango Bravo November. Basically, this is Lambert St. Louis International Airport to Waynesville-St. Roberts Regional Airport at Forney Army Airfield. We'll get into how that works in a few minutes here. This is one of the most interesting airports to fly into in the region. In my book, even the world. But we'll get to that here in just a minute as we look at the wonderful FSX default ground services in action as I open both the cargo door. Now you'll notice things kind of jumping about. That's because Shadow Play, when I bring up certain dialog boxes, pauses recording and then starts playing again. Earlier versions of Shadow Play did not have this problem, but some of the later versions in the last couple of months has had this problem with FSX. If anybody out there knows a fix for it, I've tried NVIDIA Inspector now. I'm going to try to do this by the book. We're going to do a cold engine start here. Moving up the mixture knob there, basically a couple of times primes the engine. And although I'm going to try to do this one by the book, I put the mixture knob all the way back down to fuel cutoff. Try to start the engine, and I'm already off to failing that pretty miserably by the book. I'm sure there's going to be more mistakes to come, so I will point them out, though. The mistakes that I do make as I'm trying to break bad habits from flight sim, as I will probably get back into actual flying some point later this year. A lot of this kind of depends on finances, where I stand at later this year. But I may try to join one of the aviation clubs and basically buy a 10-hour block. Usually if you buy like some of them, if you buy 10 hours at a time, you get like a 15% discount, or if you buy 10 hours, you get one free. I've also got to get in. I've got to double check. The rules for this may have changed, but I think I've also got to get a new medical certificate on file, which my primary is a flight surgeon. In fact, back growing up as a kid, he was my primary doctor, our primary family doctor. Then he got out of private practice, about 2000, right after my mom died, and joined the Air Force, actually, as a flight surgeon over at Scott Air Force Base, over just across the river in Illinois. And at some point got out of the Air Force and is back in private practice. And my health insurance, my old health insurance, pre-ACA, pre-getting married and getting on my wife's corporate plan, he was my primary doctor again. So I've been going back to see him for a couple of years, and because he started practicing back in the area again whenever I moved back, and he had been my doctor growing up, and B, he's also a licensed or registered flight surgeon, so he can do FAA medical checkouts. So hey, that worked great too. So at any rate, I'm trying to break myself of bad habits, which in FsPassengers it's easier to do because if you forget and make small mistakes, they cost you big points. So we're doing a pushback here. The tractor actually isn't activated, which may be a good thing. I've noticed with the B1900 that it tends to cause a lot of ground collision crash detections. And that will be a negative 850 points very quickly in FsPassengers. Due to really no fault of your own, it's just the way FSX detects ground collisions that it can be an issue. In particular with the 1900. This aircraft didn't seem to have a problem. Now, of course, in the real world, you could never really take a look outside your aircraft like this from behind it, but I'm making sure that flaps are adjusted and set. And if I have any recommendations to anybody out there, when it comes to FsPassengers, is make sure you set your flaps before you get takeoff clearance. Because if you touch that flap button after you get takeoff clearance, you're going to get dinged 300 points for not having your flaps properly set for takeoff. It's just almost guaranteed. Also, make sure you put down flaps for landing as well, even though there's certain situations in the real world where maybe you wouldn't do that, especially in Cessnas, if you have a longer runway. But at any rate, FsPassengers kind of make sure that you get the basics right. There's no fudging. there can be quite a bit of fudging with FS economy, as I've learned, because then it's about how many flights can you do, how quickly can you do them with time acceleration, and I will cut corners, I've found. Like flying in here, it takes into account if you overspeed your flaps and stuff like that. Again, you get dinged points. In FS economy, if you nudge a little bit over what you should on the flaps on certain aircraft, it doesn't care. So I tend to land a lot hotter in FS economy than I do in FsPassengers. So we're going around here, and if it jerks like it kind of does right here, that's because I'm bringing up other menus for whatever reasons, and Shadow Play is pausing the recording and then beginning again, which is just kind of annoying. It almost makes me want to go and get a copy of Fraps or Bandicam or something else out there. Or again, if anybody here knows how to fix this with later versions of Shadow Play, I have NVIDIA Inspector. I've tried doing it myself, hasn't worked. So let's talk a little bit about the PA-32-200T, or the Piper Seneca II. The Piper Seneca II has been in continuous production since, I believe, 1971. The Seneca II was produced from 75 until 1980. So this aircraft would be 35 to 40 years old. Now, the current iteration of aircraft is the Seneca V, and I think there may have actually been a couple of year break in manufacturing due to the economy sinking in 2008, and I think they resumed again in like 2011. I'm not 100% sure on that. There's been over 5,000 of this aircraft produced, and average price is around $800,000 to $1 million for a brand new Seneca V. Obviously, this is a much older aircraft, so the prices, I think this is only about $300,000 in FsPassengers. And when you compare it to the Seneca or the Saratoga, which has been the aircraft we have been flying, this really doesn't give you any advantages in terms of FsPassengers. It's still going to be 4 passengers, 5 if you don't have a co-pilot. Business class tickets, business class fares, same as the Saratoga. The only difference is you've got 2 engines that are going to be burning fuel instead of 1. It is a little bit faster. It is about 10-15 knots faster cruise speed. So that is a little bit of a benefit, but generally speaking, you're not going to be able to traverse that much further of a distance with this aircraft over the Saratoga. The other thing is this aircraft does require a C3 rating within the game. That is a commercial pilot's license, so you've had to fly, I believe it's about 22, 23 hours, and have 32 or 3,600 points. I can't remember at this point. But at any rate, you're going to be flying at least 20 hours worth of missions in order to get to this point. And it is a multi-engine prop, 2-engine aircraft. Now, this is an aircraft that I would consider using for essential air services in, say, a more real-world situation over the Saratoga. And the basic reason for that is you have 2 engines, so that's much better in case one does fail. You're not possibly completely out of the woods. You might still be able to make an emergency landing nearby with just 1 engine. So that's one good reason for that. The biggest thing, though, is the autopilot. This autopilot, if you are locked on to a localizer for ILS, will fly an approach vector. So it will do the automated approach. You don't want to necessarily, it's not an auto land feature, but it should line you up with the runway and get you 95% of the way there. And then basically once you cross the threshold, you cancel the autopilot and flare the aircraft a little bit and lightly touch down, gently touch down. At least that's the idea. So we're going to be taking off here. And we are pretty well fully laden between passengers and cargo, so I'm going to make sure she has plenty of altitude, and then V-rotate. Gear up, flaps up, and then I'm going to start my turn a little bit early here. Technically, the procedure here is to continue to fly the runway heading. As a result of this, generally speaking, in a general aviation aircraft, you're going to want to line up your heading bug with whatever your heading is going to be. And then once you get airborne, go to a heading hold with the autopilot until you're cleared and free to navigate and been cleared by air traffic control or the regional air traffic control to then begin your flight plan and resume your own navigation. So that's kind of mistake number 2 here. We want to be talking about flight procedures. And the textures today, the weather, we are using FSX-WX, which is a freeware weather engine. I think it works great. I know there are some people out there that swear by Rex, which is a payware weather engine, and I'm not going to dismiss that. I just personally, there's other things I much rather spend money on in flight sims than Rex when I think FSX-WX does a good enough job for my taste. Now I'm going to make the flight yoke magically disappear there. That's kind of a feature with almost every car and auto aircraft that I've owned thus far, which makes it unrealistic completely, but necessary whenever you're talking about flight sim and need to access certain buttons without using track IR to move all around the cockpit. Some people find that annoying on the channel, so I've gone to my best not to use track IR. There are a few times I still will use it. There are certain airports that it's almost mandatory, like Chicago O'Hare, whenever you're on taxi, either for takeoff or landing to the gates or to the runway. Else, things tend to run into you and cause crashes and cause you to lose 850 points as you sit there and curse the screen. Because, I'm sorry, airplane has right of way over pickup truck. I'm not bitter. Not at all. Not at all. So we're going to continue on here. I'm going to fly a heading hold, so I'm going to use the heading bug to actually navigate our course here today with autopilot, as well as an altitude hold once we get up to altitude. We are flying an IFR flight plan today, but again, this isn't the most sophisticated autopilot in the world. It is a step up from the inertial navigation system that was fairly limiting in the Saratoga. In fact, whenever we were flying into Kirksville Regional Airport the other day in the Saratoga, it was very kind of hairy with a visual approach because we didn't actually get to see the runway until we were below, I believe, about 2,500 feet, which that's the type of weather conditions that would keep you grounded under VFR rules. So at that point, it might make an effective air taxi for fair weather flying conditions, the Piper Saratoga, but I think we're going to want the Seneca II for regional EAS type air service or commercial air service as it would be. Now this route is flown in the real world by Cape Air using Cessna 402s, and we're going to be flying into, again, I will say this again, the Waynesville Regional Airport. Waynesville-St. Roberts Regional Airport at Forney Army Airfield. Well, it is actually part of Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, which is a U.S. Army base. It is still a U.S. Army airfield, and the Army maintains the passenger terminal service and the airfield itself. And then general aviation services is provided by a partnership between the towns of Waynesville and St. Roberts, which frankly have almost grown together at this day and age. But they appoint a board of directors that then run the general aviation side of things. And I think that it started to become a thing about 98. And what makes it very interesting to fly into this airport is it has restricted airspace on either side of it that is Fort Leonard Wood. So it was very, very challenging to fly into there really before the era of where GPS took over. It's not so difficult this day and age with a Garmin to actually fly the routes and stuff today. But back when you had to rely on VOR towers and your own ability to read and understand a map and understand where you are from place to place, it could be quite difficult. You could very easily find yourself in restricted airspace, which in certain circumstances may not necessarily be the best idea, especially post 9/11. Fortunately, the only times that I've flown down there, it was prior to 9/11, so things weren't quite what they are now in terms of that. So we're flying over Chesterfield area. That's Chesterfield Mall. Spirit of St. Louis Airport is around there somewhere. And this is photorealistic textures of the St. Louis area that is freeware. The image itself is from the fall-winter of 2002, 2003. And we'll see some of this more in detail in future videos when we do a flight tour of St. Louis of kind of then and now. This being then, and then I have more up-to-date textures that I've gotten for the entire state of Missouri from Mega Earth Scenery now that we'll be seeing in future videos, just not this one. Now, a lot of people, it's kind of a love or hate relationship when it comes to photorealistic textures. Some people love them, some people hate them. It does have its pros and cons. Personally, for the state of Missouri, I like having the photorealistic textures because I can relate to the area more. We own some farms. My dad owns some farms. I own some farms in southeast Missouri. And we'll actually get to physically see those farms later on in this video series because we will fly actually right over one of them. And, I like that, being able to see and, be like, okay, well, I know what I'm looking for in terms of visual landmarks. Instead of, well, we have something that's kind of over in this area. I can kind of tell where this highway kind of does this bend here and this little snake and then right after here. No, I can actually physically locate it and look for particular markers or particular visual cues and say, oh, there's the small farm, so the big farm must be down over here. And so I don't regret getting the Mega Earth Missouri Scenery Pack, but I don't necessarily have to have it for every state in the Union. I personally don't need it for flying into Colorado or New York or Illinois. Some parts of Illinois, the St. Louis Metro East, kind of have that from the freeware textures. This one is freeware. It's about 2 gigabytes to download from flyaway simulations. So, anybody can download it. At 50 kilobytes a second, it will take you a couple of days, though. It's well worth spending the $5 for 1 month of flyaway simulation subscription and download it in 20 minutes. That's what I did. So I'm just kind of looking around the cockpit here and checking out gauges and things like that. I like having my analog gauges on an airplane. I know fly-by-wire and flat panel displays are all the rage these days and everything in general aviation aircraft and flight sim and everything. And glass panel is nice. But I drive a slightly older car. I have a 2004 Chevy Impala that actually has a gauge package on it as we fly over Six Flags here. Just down below the aircraft there, that kind of blurb, that's Six Flags. That's a theme park. I think it's Six Flags St. Louis. It used to be Six Flags over Mid-America. I haven't been there in about 15 years. But my wife and I are actually going to go here in the next week or two if we ever get any warm, sunny days this spring, summer. It's been a really weird late... It reminds me a lot of the spring and summer of '93 when we had all the flooding, just without the flooding. All the flooding this time around is south in Texas. But at any rate, as we go into auto-generated scenery here, my wife actually, her first job was at Six Flags, and apparently there's something written into the statutes to where in order to work at a theme park and qualify for overtime, you have to work 50 hours in a given work week. Not 40. Apparently she worked a couple of 45, 48-hour weeks and was expecting a nice bonus in the paycheck, and nope, wasn't there. And I don't exactly sure how that works. But I'll take her word for it, considering she is the one who spent 7 years of her life as an employment law, as a litigator in employment law. So she knows a lot more about that subject than I ever want to. That's for sure, even though I went to law school. Not my area of the law. I went to study intellectual property, not employment law. Well, if you go to work for a law firm, you don't get to choose the area of law unless you're highly connected and related to somebody who's already a managing partner. Basically, you start to work for the firm, and they're going to assign you and say, you're going to be a real estate lawyer, or you're going to be a trust attorney, or you're going to be employment law, employment litigation. You don't really get to choose in most cases. In my case, I knew somebody who was getting older and close to retirement who worked for herself and was a intellectual property attorney. And if I hadn't have started a software company with some other graduate students at where I was going to law school at, and went on to sell that, I probably would have ended up taking over her practice. So, unfortunately, she just passed away not too long ago. And then, ironically, her daughter, who was also an attorney, moved out to California. Before she moved out to California, her mentor and people she worked with and her group within what is today Thompson Coburn or Thompson Mitchell back then, which is a major firm here in St. Louis, are my wife's bosses. The general counsel for the company my wife works for was Kelly's, was the person that I know, her mentor at Thompson Mitchell. And then her law school class was half the office my wife now works at. So it was interesting. They had a memorial a couple weeks ago. Went to that. Which has absolutely nothing to do about flying, but there it is. I'm about to say, it's just kind of that small. St. Louis is the biggest small town ever. The St. Louis. Well, we'll get into this when we do a flight tour of St. Louis. But the St. Louis question of where did you go to school, and that means where did you go to high school. It doesn't matter where you went to college. If you moved back, where did you go to school? And I'll get into about the St. Louis question during that video. But today we're flying southwest towards Springfield, Missouri, starting to kind of get into the Ozark Hills. And we're into auto-generated scenery now. These are, of course, improved textures from Amy Lacroix. French. I don't speak French that well. In fact, my wife wants to go to Montreal for a comedy festival this summer, and just like, yeah, we went to Europe last year for honeymoon, and it's like I can barely converse in French. I don't know what. German, I'm fine. German, Dutch, I can even, those languages are fine. Even, I'm not really Italian. But my French is just miserable. So, apologies for butchering that name, but I know this road quite well from about, Washington, I guess it's Union, Missouri, Union Pacific on down. I drove it many, many times while in college down in Springfield, Missouri, and we're coming up here. That's I-44 down there below us, Interstate 44. I'm sorry, I'm from St. Louis. That's Interstate 44. I think that's Sullivan Airport, kind of right off there, off the wingtip, off the right wingtip there. It might be Union, but I want to say that's Sullivan. And I think this is kind of Union Pacific here coming up just ahead of us. It might be a little bit further down at Sullivan. Uh-oh.
It's like we've got an electrical system problem.
Electrical failure. Failures are turned on for this airline. In theory, you have a 5% chance of failure unless you're in a higher risk zone, like a war zone or something like that, which FsPassengers will simulate. In fact, probably in a future video series, we'll be looking at flying at some more higher risk areas where, insurgents shoot out your engines on takeoff and things like that. And you can also, I think they have a scenario that is D-Day landings with DC-3s, or back in those days it would have been the C-45, or C-46 rather, was the Army variant of the DC-3, which is a darn good airplane. Still quite a few of them flying in rough parts of the world. Same thing with a DC-6, but we'll explore those in different series of videos here. I'm now looking here and trying to find the emergency emitter and see if it actually functions. And I think that's the emergency. Let me turn on track IR here so I can get a better look. Yep, that's the emergency emitter. So let's get back into flying into this particular airport this day and age.
Pan, we have a problem aboard.
So, we're flying into an airport that has restricted airspace, military airspace, on either side of it. If this had happened in the real world, I probably would be diverting to either Sullivan, which I think we just passed. It might have been St. Clair. If not there, then certainly one of the airports at Rolla, which is about halfway in between St. Louis and Fort Leonard Wood, and landing there. The reason being is I don't really feel like flying through restricted military airspace, even though the emergency transponder should be on at this point, and the emergency transponder should also have its own power supply independent of the electrical system of the aircraft. But this is another reason why I particularly like flying aircraft that still have gauges in them. Now, I understand that all aircraft are still required to maintain backup analog instrumentation. Doesn't matter what it is, just in case this happens, in particular for airspeed, altitude, heading, and magnetic compass. Because if your electrical system flails, if it flails or fails, you're kind of shit up a creek. And the general tendency, not only in aircraft but automobiles as well, has been to get away from dials and gauges and into flat panel everything. I don't particularly like that. I still drive a 2004 Chevy Impala that has a gauge package on it. And it's kind of nice because back in the fall, my battery was starting to get a little weak, and you could start to see it in the gauge. A couple of years ago, needed to add a little bit more coolant, but it was pretty clear that needed more coolant wasn't a thermostat issue, because you would have been able to tell based on how the gauge reacted. And the same thing about aircraft. Now, gauges, like fly-by-wire, aren't foolproof. The pitot tubes can freeze over in the right conditions, and then you're not going to get indicated airspeeds and things like that. Can be a problem. You have to go to static bypass valves and all of that good stuff. So analog instrumentation, by all means, isn't necessarily foolproof. But I don't know, it's just relying everything on going to fly-by-wire, and certain aircraft I understand it, but fly-by-wire and flat panel displays in general aviation aircraft, I'm just not a big a fan of. Call me old-fashioned, but I want to make sure that I know, as again, legally required to have backup gauges. But I much prefer analog gauges because in a situation like this, my GPS is out, my radio stack is out, my transponder is out, autopilot dead. But I still maintain control of the aircraft because it's not fly-by-wire. It is a mechanically controlled airplane, probably not electro, but mechanical, hydraulically controlled. I'm not 100% sure on the Seneca II. Again, never flown one in real life. Really have never looked into the aircraft seriously, towards purchasing one or even flying one. I really don't know if there's any Piper Senecas. There's been over 5,000 of them built over the years, but I don't know if there's any of them in the local area or not, to be frankly honest with you. So I'm trying different buttons and things to see if I can possibly get my radio stack still working. This is why I have a ICOM handheld transceiver in my flight bag. In the real world, I carry a handheld backup just in case something like this would happen in an aircraft and the radio stack would go out. You could at least still communicate with the tower and things like that to clear your emergency, and it has its own lithium-ion battery in it, 5-watt power. So again, not ideal, and even then there's also a battery backup that uses, I think, like 6 or 8 AA's as well. And I have both of those things. It pays to be prepared. If you're a general aviation, private aviation aircraft, you're much more likely to die in a crash than, say, in an airliner. And one of the reasons behind that is a lot of general aviation pilots and private pilots don't have the hours and hours and hours of training. Friends of mine who are commercial airline pilots, for every hour they spent flying, they probably spent 10 to 20 hours in front of a FAA-certified flight simulator. And there are those around. I know at St. Charles here, they have a Redbird simulator. I actually haven't ever rented it out, and I probably should, and have a flight instructor look over my shoulder, because it has been about 4 years since my last flight in my logbook. So I need to do that and make sure that I purge myself of stupid flight sim FSX habits that you just can't get away with in the real world. FS Economy is particularly bad about this because FsPassengers, it knows the programmed limitations of aircraft. Now, how accurately those flight models are programmed into the configuration files, that can be another matter. But if you overspeed the flaps, let's say in the B1900, you're going to get deducted points for that, or even in the Seneca II. Carnado aircraft, while they're not perfect, they're not an A-to-A simulation study aircraft. This aircraft is realistic enough. Again, it's an intermediate level cockpit, meaning I wouldn't use it for real world training, but it is certainly a step up from the default aircraft that are available in FSX. But it's not quite to an A-to-A Cessna 172, which if I really want to fly a Piper Cherokee, but I don't know. I think basically 172s are what are available. I spent most of probably about 65, 70 hours of my about 110 hours. I mean, I'm one of these pilots. I've only got 110 flight hours to my name. And 70, I think 65, 70 of that was in a Cessna 162, about another 20, 25 in a 172, another 10 in a 182, and the rest, I think, was a Piper Cherokee. Of that, I like flying the Cherokee more than the Cessnas. I don't know. I like the look of the Cherokee more than I do of the Cessna. There's nothing wrong with the Cessna 172 or 182 or even 162. They're perfectly good airplanes, especially for flight training. They're very easy to fly, relatively speaking, very forgiving aircraft, unless you do something completely stupid. And, hey, for most general aviation pilots, great aircraft to fly. I just don't like the look of Cessnas. I never have. I do not like that high wing design. I like the low slung monowing planes like Beechcraft Bonanza. I love the V-tail in the Bonanza. I just love how that aircraft looks. I like Piper aircraft. I like Beechcraft aircraft. When I take a look at those airplanes, I think those are cool. Those are sleek. Those are planes that I want to fly. Piper Saratoga, things like that. And that's just personal aesthetics, to be completely honest with you. But again, a situation like this comes up in a real world. How many hours have I spent practicing for this, preparing for this situation in the real world? Very few. A few hours in simulators, and kind of going through what-if scenarios on flight tests with flight instructors, things like that. But it's not something that I practice day in, day out, every week, every month. My friends that are airline pilots, for about every hour that they spent, probably not so much to this day, but early on in their careers, they logged hundreds of hours in simulators, in FAA-approved simulators, for their aircraft type, getting a type certification before they went out with instructor pilots for those checkouts to get their type certs. And a lot of their hours in the simulator is literally running through emergency checklists. What happens if an engine flames out? What happens if an aileron breaks? What happens if your flaps get jammed? What happens if your nose gear won't come down? And they train and practice those scenarios over and over and over until they get them right, until they know in the back of their hand. And they know exactly what to do. Think about a few years ago when that, I think it was an Airbus, landed in the Hudson River. I mean, hats off to that pilot. He was one tremendously skilled pilot. I think Scully was his name. Some people call him hero and stuff like that. I think he was still doing his job, but, as somebody who's flown 105, 110 hours, that hats off to him. That was just a tremendous piece of flying. And he was the first one to say he had practiced how many thousands of hours in flight simulators preparing for that type of an emergency. Maybe not that exact emergency, but in situations like this, you can't go to the, procedures list and then go thumbing through it and say, I have this procedure. In the larger aircraft and stuff like that, if you're at 35,000 feet, you have a co-pilot, and then back in the olden days, you also had a flight engineer to pull those up and start reading off the checklist and stuff like that. But even before they got to that checklist, you have to be going, okay, this just happened, step 1, step 2, step 3. If you sit there and go, oh my God, what is the world has happening to me, especially in a general aviation aircraft, you are probably more than less likely going to end up seriously injured or dead. Because at most VFR altitudes, you get exactly one chance to possibly recover, and if you fail to do so, that's not only the end of your flying career, it is most likely the end of your life. And that is something that a lot of people, I won't say a lot of people, I know a few people who have gotten their private pilot's license who personally I felt never really had any business, because they just never seem to take that element, from my personal experience or my personal opinion, seriously enough. I know that some of them some people I've flown with and know and stuff, they're like, oh man, I love being up there and just looking around at the vistas and stuff. I'm like, I don't know about you, but anytime I'm in a cockpit controls in the cockpit behind the controls and flying, I don't get to enjoy the experience. I'm always checking to make sure nothing's going to go wrong. There might be once or twice for a flight, for maybe a split second or a couple of seconds, that maybe I get to look around and say, oh, that's nice. My passengers get to enjoy flights far more than I do. Because again, I kind of have a duty there to, make sure everybody lands safely. And as such, I tend to keep my eyes on the gauges and eyes on the horizon, back down on the gauges, back on the horizon. Now granted, autopilot, even if it is just inertial navigation hold, heading and altitude hold, does free you up to then deal with radios and things like that. But again, I carry a handheld, battery-powered backup, basically transponder, radio transceiver, in case the instrumentation in the aircraft fails, and just this type of situation. Now, the last thing I'm going to do is go to try and fly, in particular this airport, and try to fly into a airport that has restricted military airspace on both sides of it without a radio and transponder stack working. I would divert to, again, probably Rolla, Sullivan. I think there's also an airport at Cuba. I have to consult the charts. But I would be landing at one of those airports and seeing about trying to get a fix. I wouldn't be flying into military restricted and controlled airspace without that. But this is the flight simulator world, so we're going to continue on as scheduled. So Fort Leonard Wood, and my family in particular, has kind of an interesting history there. It was purchased from my great-grandfather and grandfather and uncles, and basically my grandfather's brothers and sisters, back in the 1930s via eminent domain by the U.S. Army. And where the Ramseys had made their money was raising mules, even back to during the Civil War. And that part of the Ramsey clan was very kind of interesting because they had a tendency to name children after famous world leaders, and they have for several generations. I mean, there's more than one Marquis de Lafayette Ramsey in the family, as well as Napoleon Bonaparte Ramsey. And again, one of my grandfather's cousins, Boney, he just passed away in the last 5 years. He served in World War II. He was a pilot. Flew, I believe, F-4F Wildcats and Corsairs later in the war, off jeep carriers, off escort carriers. Never heard him talk about it. I wasn't around him that much, but he would stop by once or twice a year, coming back to Missouri to visit. Spent his career, I believe, at DuPont, either Dow Chemical or DuPont, one of the two, and then later went on to work for the World Bank, spent a lot of years down in Brazil. At any rate, he never talked about his naval service. His wife was from Chicago, and she was in the waves back during World War II. And of the 5 or 6 guys she dated in World War II, Boney was the only one who came back. She had like 4 or 5 dead fiancés that died during the war. And met Boney and wouldn't accept Boney's proposal until he came back alive, which at that point I guess don't really blame her. But she was a character and a half. Boney kind of was too, but Boney never talked about his military service. And this is something that, looking back on it, I now notice those who served in Europe generally would at least somewhat talk about, grandfather, the ambulance driver, or driver for a dentist. He would talk about his experiences in World War II and in the European theater, primarily because I don't think most of them saw really any frontline combat. A lot of them were clerks, truck drivers, behind the front lines type actions. Most of them were not combat soldiers, but those who fought in the Pacific, man, they never ever talk about any of their experiences. Uncle Joe, he was a cook on a destroyer. In fact, the only thing he would talk about there was the fact that one of his shipmates was Red Skelton, the comedian. If you don't know who Red Skelton is, you're probably A, young, B, go look him up sometime. I can imagine that must have been a riot back in the day to serve on a ship with him being another one of the cooks. But he would never talk about anything, World War II. Boney would never talk about World War II. Any of them, especially any of the guys who were Marines, would just, they wouldn't go there. I've only heard any of them talk about their experiences in World War II in the Pacific once, and that was shortly after 9/11, and a comment they made that wouldn't probably be too popular with a lot of people around these days on what it takes to win a war against people that have a mentality of folks such as ISIS. And it's not pretty. I mean, these men witnessed what has to be one of the most brutal, as William McNamara said, was one of the most brutal wars in all of human history. a war in which killing 100,000 people in a night was just deemed necessary and therefore done, which is something that today in the modern world, at least in the modern Western world, isn't something that would be too popular with public opinion. But their generation viewed it if that's what it would take to win the war, that's what we did. And I don't think that there's that political mentality, at least in the West, exists on the same level. And they kind of recognized it too. As I said, as his basically statement was our generation was a bunch of pussies and couldn't stomach the fight that would have to be undertaken. And in certain respects, he probably is right, unfortunately. Ultimately, when you're up facing groups like ISIS and stuff like that, the level of brutality that it ultimately takes to suppress it is just about unthinkable this day and age. But they were of a different generation in a different era that frankly saw that level of brutality firsthand. So yes, the family used to own Fort Leonard Wood. In fact, the post commander used to live in a house, the old, I think, Ramsey Plantation house. That was, I think it was called the Ramsey House. I think it's been torn down by now, but back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, up until sometime in the 80s. And additionally, there is still the Ramsey family cemetery there. And one of the interesting things about the Ramsey family cemetery is, even if the base is at a heightened alert status, we as family members still have a right to see that cemetery. Now, they will take you there via armed guard. Go into the base post. I mean, if it's a red alert type situation where everything is locked down and nobody's getting in or out, of course can't go. But even if they're under heightened security requirements, your car gets checked. Why are you here? I'm here to see the the Ramsey family cemetery. They'll basically search your car and then take you to visitor parking, and then from there you go with the MPs in a Humvee and they drive you to the cemetery and you can look around. I've done that before. That was about 2001, maybe early 2002 that I did that. There's also an Army engineering museum there that if you ever on the way on I-44 and have a half a day and you can stop off and spend a couple hours there, it's worth it. A couple other interesting things about Fort Leonard Wood as we come up here. But since my radio is essentially broken, I'm using a tried and true method of aerial navigation called FTR. This stands for follow the road, or we used this previously in the first episode as follow the river navigation, where basically, let's say you want to fly from St. Louis to Kansas City, you line up on I-70 and you follow it all the way to Kansas City from St. Louis, or vice versa. Or if you want to fly to Springfield from St. Louis, you line up on I-94 or I-44 and you head southwest following I-44. It will get you there. It is just, however, not quite allowed under FAA regulations. You're supposed to be flying beacon to beacon. However, that all kind of changed. It's called area navigation or random navigation, hence RNAV. It was allowed back during the 60s and 70s. I think in the 80s they disallowed it because pilots were filing RNAV. It should be an IFR flight plan, an instrument flight plan. But what pilots were doing were using inertial navigation, basically like we had in the Piper Saratoga, and instead using those instruments to fly randomly, and it became known as random navigation, and eventually the FAA said, no, you can't do that, because there was an actual instrument. It was, I think it was called like an area navigator or something like that. It's basically a trig-based flight instrument that you would line up VOR Tower 1, VOR Tower 2, and it would calculate what the angle would be to fly between the two of them in a straight line from point A to point B using good old trigonometry, an electromechanical calculator, or computer calculation. Analog computer, basically. Yes, was such a thing. Battleships used them back in World War II. But again, the FAA basically found out most pilots were using inertial navigation to fake it and decided, we're not going to allow this. But with the introduction of GPS and satellite navigation, I don't know when they started allowing it again, but sometime in the 2000s, I think, RNAV became a thing again using GPS. So random navigation. So I'm not exactly sure when. If you know when the FAA allowed RNAV again, put it down in the comment sections. I'm just not exactly sure what they allow for anymore. And there's also RNAV approaches, GPS approach. You can fly into airports and things of that nature, which we would be doing here today if it wasn't for the fact that, we don't have any radios or GPS because of electrical failure. So I now know I'm over the Fort Leonard Wood area. I'm familiar with the area enough from driving it a lot of times during my college days and flying down in this area a couple of times in my life. I kind of know which town from one town to the next and things like that. And it's hence why I ended up getting the the photorealistic scenery for the state of Missouri, because, hey, I grew up here, I've flown here, I've driven around the state quite a bit, at least from I-70 south. I know that general lay of the land pretty good. Fairly well, I guess. But I'm now trying to find, I think I see the airfield here. So I'm going to try to fly an intercept vector, roughly. I mean, I'm going to be landing in visual. This is going to be a visual approach. There she is. There's the airport. It had to be around here somewhere. I think that's the airport. I'm pretty sure it's the airport. I think that's the correct airport. So we see the runway markers. Now, apparently it says here it is not tower controlled. Although we don't have a radio anyway, so I guess it really doesn't matter. But let's just put it this way. We don't exactly have clearance. Now, we have declared an emergency. When you declare an emergency in FsPassengers, your approval rating automatically goes to 70% with 30% in flux at any given time. Now, if you make it down safely, that 30% for the most part gets returned to you, and you also get bonus points for landing under an emergency situation. Now, this is one of the areas where we get to cheat in Microsoft Flight Simulator land, because I'm looking at the aircraft going, oh crap, the landing gear is not responding. Neither is the flaps. Now, I had turned off basically the avionics because, uh-oh. And I'm like, oh crap, now we'd have to do a belly landing if we went in right now. And what I'm doing right now is I'm hitting Control G, which is, I believe, the shortcut key for manually deploying the landing gear on aircraft. And you can start to see it starting to budge. So there's a manual gear, usually a crank knob on aircraft, general aviation aircraft, as well as at least older aircraft like B-25s and DC-3s, DC-8s, or DC-6s. DC-8s are jet aircraft. Maybe on those two, but they basically have a crank knob, and you could get a drill, mechanical like drill press thing, and literally crank down the landing gear. If the hydraulics failed, the navigator or the engineer would have to go and crank down the airport or air landing gear. Unfortunately here, I'm trying to get this to work, and I'm bringing up the manual, and I'm looking for manual runway or manual landing gear release because I'm hitting Control G and it doesn't seem to be working. Alright, I'm hitting the right button, but again, nothing seems to be happening. But hey, I got my flaps, it looks like, at least partially down. That's a start. So we're going to have at least some flaps for landing. Oh, here. Hey. What's going on? Come on. There we go. All right, landing gear out. Locked and loaded, I hope. A lot of times if you have to manually deploy the landing gear, getting them to actually lock into place can be a little bit iffy. You hope you have it extended and locked into place, so you want to make sure that you land in a situation like this as gently as possible. And frankly, this is one of those things that I just think I would have a better feel for in the real world compared to the virtual world, because in the virtual world you have to rely on our instruments as well as kind of a little bit of a hunch. In the real world, you can kind of feel that lift. I don't know how else to describe it. It's a much more visceral experience. You know when you've lightly touched it down, and you're kind of hanging out at that just last little bit, and that poof. You can just kind of feel it. I don't know how else to really describe that feeling. This would be one of those situations where I wish you could, in the flight simulator thing, simulate having a handheld battery backup transceiver radio. Because again, I have one in my flight bag, just in case something like this happens. They're not cheap either. I think mine was about $400 or $500. Well, nothing involving real-world flight is what you call cheap. You know, headsets are, I think about, what was my Clark headset? I think about $300. I think the radio was $4 or $5. I don't know what they cost these days. Might have gotten cheaper. And no, there is not an app for that, kids. You have to have an actual radio. I do not believe your cell phone, your iPhone will work. Well, at these altitudes, your phone would work and wouldn't necessarily be FAA approved. But if all else fails, you could dial 911. The handoffs from tower to tower shouldn't be that bad, I would think. So if all else failed, yeah, pull out the cell phone, dial 911, and say, yeah, I'm in an airplane, no radio controls, going to be landing at Rolla. You know, have emergency equipment standing by. Tell them, you know, look up on the runway list. This is the runway I'm coming in on. Tell them to clear traffic. I don't know. I honestly, I don't know if Rolla is actually tower control or not. Oh, there's actually a couple airports at Rolla. I think it's like Rolla National. I'm trying to remember this off the top of my head. But it's a general aviation airport. But I can't remember if it's Oh. So I'm just trying to kind of gently maneuver, finding the airfield again. I'm at about 3,000 feet. Got the flaps fully deployed, so I'm trying to keep the altitude and airspeed and everything real gentle. And I've done something very bad here, and that is lose track of where I was physically. I've lost situational awareness. This would be an absolute disaster in the real world. Especially if you're flying solo, or if I was flying solo. If you have other people in the aircraft, you can be like, hey, keep an eye out as I try to figure out, as I spent, 5 or 6 minutes trying to get the landing gear down. Now my response would be, keep an eye out on the airport and tell me which direction it is when I tell you. So I'm trying to find the airport. I know if I generally head north, I'm going to probably run into it again, or at least run into a landmark like I-44. I'm sorry, I'm from St. Louis. I-44. Okay. Hopefully I'm not overstressing the flaps. I don't think I read the placard or the details on what the various G limits and airspeed limits are on the flaps and things like that. There's a little placard actually on the console of the aircraft, kind of right underneath the airspeed and right above the pitch indicator, which we don't have any pitch indication because that runs off electricity. So the only thing we have is the artificial horizon, I believe. I have to double check. But an artificial horizon in the right there. So we're trying to find the air base again, airfield. Again, this is not something that you want to be doing on a given day in a real world, flying over a military air base or an army, not an air base, but an army base, without having direct communications with the tower. And although I would be squawking an emergency signal, but at the same time, not something you want to be doing this day and age. It's probably a good day or a good thing this day and age to get F-15 scrambled, although I don't know where you would be, where they'd be scrambling from, because we no longer have the 131st Fighter Group at Lambert. They moved out in 2006, I think, about 10 years ago. And their